The chapter begins talking about the creeds as giving us verbal space for conversation. Sam, you warn us that the history of Constantinople 381 is a warning against sentimentality. So the creeds, which are designed to open dialogue within constraints, but tend in history to become sort of doctrinaire. And we tend to end up with papal infallibility at one end and fundamentalism at the other end, as it were, if one may say, the two ends. And certainly within evangelicalism, the sort of idea of soundness and so forth, which is developed, it goes by different names, but it is often there. So I was just fascinated of that sort of thing that's in the sort of DNA of the church as spelled out. But then the creeds tend to do the opposite, and we then tend to make them tests of whether someone is okay or not, or whether we're going to exclude them. So I would be interested to hear, Sam, your thoughts on, how is it that we get that the sort of ignoring of the fundamental process, what's going on there, so that they become almost reversed in their intent?
Well, I think that what you're describing is more than one thing going on at the same time. So if you look at the Council of Chalcedon, the Chalcedonian definition is followed by a whole bunch of anathemas. So they were clearly in the business of exclusion. But I think there's a number of differences between what the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, which we call the Nicene Creed, it is doing, and what somebody is doing by calling someone else sound or not. The first of all, which is, and it sounds rather pious, but we're talking about documents from the undivided church here. This is the early church. I mean, you could say we're still the early church. I think I would say we're still the early church, but this is the very early church who are identifying, the two key questions, really. So question one is, how can we say we believe in Jesus Christ and still say we believe in one God? And the second question is, how can we say Jesus is human and divine and yet one person? So, those are the two basic questions, it seems to me, that we need to find answers to. And the two, the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedonian definition provide the best answers that were available to the early church. And for all that people mock them, we haven't come up with much better answers since then. We've more or less accepted the language of substance and person and so on, the hypostatic union language. However, later in the day, parts of the church, not the holy and undivided church, but parts of the church have found it necessary to make other questions, other than those two fundamental questions, axiomatic. And some of those questions have been doctrinal, like penal substitution, and some of those questions have been ethical, like apartheid. My inclination would be to stick with the original two questions and say those questions, in a sense, provide the x-axis and the y-axis for all future doctrinal investigation, and they are to mix a metaphor, they are the litmus test, against which we work out whether we're kind of in the Christian game at all. So it's in that spirit, I think, that I'm saying in that section of the chapter about the creed, that once we accept that, we can be more relaxed about recognizing the very human process by which certainly the Nicene Creed and to some extent the Chalcedonian definition were arrived at. You know, some of the descriptions of the Council of Nicaea are really hair-raising. But I just wouldn't give that level of authority to any other post-scriptural Christian document. So when we talk about the creeds and the formulations or the formularies of the Church of England, like the 39 Articles and the Ordinal, the Book of Common Prayer, none of these for me have the same authority as those two creeds. And while we might slightly wince at one or two of the parts of the language, and it's quite common for people to say, "Oh, I'm not able to say every article of the creed." I sort of think, well, which line in particular are you stumbling over? Is it the full divinity of Christ? Is it the full divinity of the Holy Spirit? Is it the resurrection of the dead? Is it the life ever? Is it the forgiveness of sins? These are all fairly fundamental things to Christianity, it seems to me. But for someone to say, "I'm not sure I can go along with penal substitution," doesn't seem to me a big deal at all, because it's never been articulated amongst the core doctrines of the worldwide church.
Mm. Do you think it's down to basic human hubris that people try to find something more doctrinaire, or is it down to a sort of a faith which sort of protests against uncertainty, that sort of thing? I mean, not that is true faith, but if you know what I mean.
Well, I think, as I've said on this call before, I've been very influenced by George Lindbeck's threefold understanding of what doctrine is. The first understanding being the cognitive propositional, a quasi-scientific list of beliefs. It's a phrase. I preached a sermon at St. Martin's about this a couple of weeks ago, about the difference between belief and trust. And that notion of a belief, which is, by common, media definition today, irrational and bizarre, the kind of thing that stops parents allowing their dying child to receive a blood transfusion or something like. The media presents this as beliefs. They can't be reasoned with. You can't have a conversation with these people. They're probably run by mullahs. Some spiritual leader of the kind that I would love to be actually has indoctrinated. It's quasi cult like. Mm-hmm. I think I do often think about retiring and setting up a cult, because I do think that that's where most of the fun lies. But I've never quite managed to have to pull it off. And then the second lot is experiential expressive. And and experiential exppressive is the Enlightenment turn to the subject, and the evaluation of everything by what's in it for me, how it makes me feel, what it makes me do, and then the third kind is cultural linguistic, which is much more like a language, and much more like a community form of behavior. And I guess what I was doing in the sermon was distinguishing between number 1 and number 3, and calling number 3 trust. And my pushback against the doctrinal statements you have to sign to teach at Wheaton College or something like that, that kind of thing, that's a series of beliefs, and those beliefs detached from sacrificial and accountable practices of community, to me, they're not meaningless, but they're not doing what Christian doctrine should be doing. which is leading us into forms of life, they become weapons, in my experience.
Yeah.
And of course, like any kind of authorized statement, they are at the mercy of their interpreters. And so what you get is an official or unofficial hierarchy who say what the Lausanne Convention or what the the five principles of Calvinism actually mean, and then they become a kind of inquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And that pattern has just been repeated in church history many, many times. So I would, I'm fairly dogmatic about the creeds, in that I do think those set the playing field for everything else that we're talking about. But I'd be pretty loose on almost anything else. I think I'd also struggle to say that if you uphold apartheid, you can't be a Christian. Not because I think apartheid's a good idea, but because I'm a bit reluctant to feel it's my role to tell somebody that they aren't a Christian. I think if they subscribe to the creeds, they may well be a Christian. They may not be a kind of Christian I want to hang out with or spend a lot of time with or give any endorsement to, but I'm not sure I'm in a position to tell them that they're not. Because that is just creating another kind of fundamentalism, it seems to me.
Interesting what you said about the creeds being life-giving or something to that effect, because when you come on to some examples from the Gospels, Martha, do you believe this, to Martha, Peter's confession of faith at Caesarea Philippi, and indeed the thief on the cross, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom, which are sort of life-giving. I've been reading that. I began to wonder whether those statements of faith reflect the practice of the early church to some extent, rather than form it. Or I guess they're always in conversation. But I'm just wondering whether, when John wrote that, "Do you believe this?" When he was writing his gospel, he was thinking about what they did on a Sunday morning.
I think that's a very creative suggestion, and it may well be true. But I had that little story about the community worker who joined my little church in Norwich and then ended up being baptized and saying, when I said, "How do you feel about this?" at the age of 52 or whatever she was, and she said, "Well, I've come to realize it's about obedience." And I don't think you feel the force of that unless you imagine the kind of person she was, for whom the word obedience simply wasn't in her vocabulary. She thought she was a community worker who was empowering people and allowing them to express their talents. And the idea that you should be obedient to something, was a bit like telling someone to become to put a burqa on. It was just outside her thought world. But she didn't come to the church the first Sunday she came to the church and say, "I'm coming to look for something to be obedient to." That was a retrospective statement over about 18 months of being assimilated into the community, and realizing that you have the words of eternal life in terms of John chapter 6. This is my home. This is everything that I want to represent me, and there's got to be a cost to that if it's going to be good. So and I think that's how it works. That in a sense, all of those statements, I suppose it's slightly different with the thief on the cross. But Peter, I think it's very similar to the Peter at Caesarea Philippi story, where he's looking back over, 18 months of following Jesus up and down Galilee. And Jesus says, "Well, what actually do you think this is all about?" My sense is that he hadn't formulated those words before he said them there and then. And I think that can be the case for a lot of us. In a relationship, the classic case of the couple who share a house with a bunch of others at university or in some other setting, and then at the end of 4 years, they look each other in the eye and say, well, what's this really been about? And they say, well, I think I really want to be living you for the rest of my life as well. But they didn't go into the house with that thing, with that thought in their mind. And I think it's that sort of realization, and that's why you can see why I think belief is such an inadequate word in the way that the word is used for what, that's growing trust, that's relationship, that's growing understanding.
I like,
it's proof of the pudding in the eating, really.
Yeah, I liked the way you developed that obedience into how we make the peace non-sentimental. You gave the example of the Shakur who locking the church door so that no one could go till they'd, as it were, all change their lives. I wasn't quite sure if that would work on Sunday morning at St. Martin's or indeed here.
No, I mean, you can only try it once, really. It is an amazing story.
Yes.
And I don't know if you know him or his. I did have the opportunity to meet him quite some time ago, and you think he's going to be this sort of charismatic individual. In fact, he's this rather austere, huge bearded. Well, he was then. This is quite a long time ago now, but quite gruff kind of individual. But it's such a powerful story because he's right. He's exercising, rather assertively, a profoundly priestly role. He's saying we cannot go to the table unless we are reconciled. It's all there in the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
So that is peace big time. That is, and I suppose those are the best stories in the book, really, because they actually show what the liturgy actually means in the life of a community and how it transforms communities if you actually do the liturgy right, and how it isn't just a feeble little handshake or now a kind of kowtow to one another. It is actually a physically demanding, exasperating, infuriating process. A little bit like it would be at an elementary, primary school where two kids are told they have to say sorry to each other, otherwise they can't have lunch.
Do you think there might be equivalents we can do to that? I mean, there's Vincent Donovan scooping up the grass to present to the first elders and so on. Do you think there are equivalents of what we might do at primary school, or scooping up the grass on a Sunday morning? Have you come up with practical things there?
I've tried to mix things around, and I think I refer to this, one or two away days, for example. I've certainly done it myself in terms of recognizing, even when I was robed and at the front, that I needed to, walk back to row 15 and shake somebody's hand after, a nasty exchange of emails or something earlier in the week, or a difficult meeting in which words were said. And from time to time, I've kind of articulated those kind of words in introducing the piece to nudge people to actually live the piece as opposed to see it. It seems to me the handshake of the piece is like the wafer of bread at communion. It's a tiny symbolic thing that represents a massive actual thing, and part of our role in leading liturgy is to make people aware of the massive actual thing, and occasionally to enact the massive actual thing. So they're both, and the confession similarly. They're all sort of elemental things which represent enormous things.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I wonder whether now, Andy, would be a good moment to begin to broaden this out a little bit. We've done quite a bit of covering of the chapter. What we haven't particularly talked about is the intercessions aspect. So I just flag up that element remains there. But hopefully our conversation...
Well, I wrote a whole, but that spun off into a whole mini series and did a whole book on crafting prayers for public worship, which is, which isn't. I didn't just revisit this stuff and expand it, but it is, it's a longer version of the same thing. It's trying to do something slightly different, but this certainly, writing this for the first time helped me understand the moral significance of intercession. That little list I give of the difference between pain and sin, and the difference between suffering and evil, and that in a sense that's as articulating as explicitly as anywhere in these last 5 chapters what I how worship shapes character, which is the the premise of the whole of those 5 chapters. Because I think I get more cross at badly led intercessions than I do at a bad sermon, because it the idea that we can fail adequately to describe God, or what an appropriate response to God is not is not a big surprise, and is very much forgivable. But the idea that but we almost reveal more when we turn around and face God and speak to God directly, and if we phrase that in a way that shows a profoundly impoverished notion of who God is or how God acts, then I sort of think we've let our people down, or shown something that I really wished I didn't have to see.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for that. I used your book on intercessions and did a bit of training of all our prayers at St. Paul's once, and sat down with each of them for half an hour and began to talk about some of the aspects of it. So it was very useful. I'm
very happy to. That's exactly what it's for, really.
Yeah.
I do that with the group here every couple of years, and we give them a copy just to just for the main points again. And a lot of people say, oh, I've been doing this for years, and I say, well, it's especially for you, really.
Yes. Yeah. Well, others may want to put some questions in here.